I couldn't have imagined there would be people as close to power as there are now who share ideas this radical. So Friedrich Hayek is the most well-known leader of what you could call the organized neoliberal movement, the intellectual movement. 1938 was the first time people said, we call ourselves neoliberals, and what they saw themselves as doing was fending off the fascist collectivists on their right and the socialist and communist collectivists on their left. He helped organize people who he thought were defending the flame of economic freedom in a time when the welfare state was expanding, planning was expanding, helping explain why people who are primarily interested in economic freedom or free markets would end up, creating alliances with people who are primarily ethno-nationalists. Often in the post-2016 moment, when we talk about the right or the far right, it's understood as an irrational, emotional, outburst expression. So it's because of hate, it's because of resentment, it's a lack of understanding, perhaps even an ignorance. But what I show is that actually there are self-contained arguments for racism inside the far-right world in ways that heavily overlap with the neoliberal thought community, which come to conclusions about racial inferiority and superiority through economic reasoning.
Quinn Slobodian, welcome to PoliticsJOE.
Good to be here.
It's excellent to have you here with us again. We're here to talk about your new book, Hayek's Bastards, the Neoliberal Roots of the Populist Right. Before we get into it, I would like to make an apology to you on behalf of PoliticsJOE. When you were here last time, we initially titled the YouTube video Economist Explains. And we have a good reason. Well, it's not a good reason, a cynical reason. Economist Explains was doing particularly well for us on YouTube.
Right,
So
okay.
we were trying to justify anyone we interviewed as an economist.
Yeah, an apologist is also good.
I'm the apologist, you're not an economist.
Yeah.
Do you accept PoliticsJOE?
Willing to wear that drag whenever expedient.
It was expedient for us.
Yeah.
How would you describe yourself if not an economist?
A historian.
Excellent. There's a distinction there.
There is, and I'm not even an economic historian, it must be said, in the sense that I'm pretty innumerate. I don't really work with numbers or not many graphs in my book. So I think and I'm also not quite a historian of economic thought, because that's like a really specific category. So I've actually been forced to reinvent myself, and thinking about a category of history of political economy is one of the ways I've tried to describe myself.
Well, it's a fancy title. Your book has a very punchy title.
Yeah.
Where did the title come from?
So the title Hayek's Bastards is actually an homage to this book that meant a lot to me when I was a teenager called Voltaire's Bastards, written by this guy named John Ralston Saul, who's quite a well-known public intellectual in my home country of Canada. And the way that book unfurled was really exciting and inspirational to me as a teenager, because he took on this huge multi-century topic about rationality and reason, but through biographical stories and sketches. So I specifically remember Robert McNamara, for example, who moved from, auto CEO to Kennedy's White House to the World Bank. And that approach always inspired me, how you can use small stories to tell an enormous story. So when I saw it fitting with this subject matter, which we'll be getting into, it seemed like a natural tip of the hat to this old inspiration.
So who was Hayek and who are his bastards?
So Friedrich Hayek is the most well-known leader of what you could call the organized neoliberal movement, the intellectual movement that came together in the 1930s. 1938 was the first time people said, we call ourselves neoliberals, and what they saw themselves as doing was fending off the fascist collectivists on their right and the socialist and communist collectivists on their left. Hayek himself was an Austrian, born in 1899, fled here to Britain in part, brought by a position at the London School of Economics, and eventually, happy to have his distance from the fascist governments of Central Europe. And he helped organize people who he thought were defending the flame of economic freedom in a time when the welfare state was expanding, planning was expanding. And into the post-war period, the post-war decades, he kept on having this set of arguments with a bunch of intellectuals, some of whom you could see as more like his children, and some, as I argue in the book, who are sort of taking a hard right turn towards domains that I think qualify them as illegitimate children or bastards of his line of thought.
And who are these bastards on the world stage? Who are we talking about?
The people I focus in on the book are ones who have often been seen as thinkers of the far right. The point of me picking them out is that I think the narrative from 2016 onward that the rise of the far right was a backlash against neoliberalism was missing the fact that a lot of the core thinkers inside of the far right were often coming out of this very neoliberal intellectual movement itself. So one of those people who's quite well known in the United States is a guy named Charles Murray. Also had his moment of influence here in the UK in the Thatcher government, who was most well known for this book called The Bell Curve he co-wrote in 1994, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which helped to bring back a language of scientific racism. Peter Brimelow is another one of these so-called Hayek's bastards from the book, who is, really more of a conservative. He's British by birth and is often seen as one of the most important advocates of hard borders nativism, and was sometimes described as a godfather of the alt-right, but has his origins in the financial press, rubbing shoulders with a lot of these neoliberal, orthodox thinkers. So helping explain why people who are primarily interested in economic freedom or free markets would end up, creating alliances with people who are primarily ethno-nationalists or scientific racists was the kind of riddle that this book set out to solve.
Was there an impetus to you wanting to solve that riddle? Because I'm imagining you wrote it before. Well, if you'd written it post-Trump too, I'd be very, very impressed.
Yes, no, that would be.
But you must have written it during the Biden administration. Started writing it during the Biden administration.
I actually even earlier. So last time we spoke, I had this book called "Crack Up Capitalism" that had just come out.
An excellent book.
Thank you. And this is in a way, a kind of B-sides of that book. So a lot of the things that I wrote here, I wrote those sentences the first time probably in 2017. So it was really after the Charlottesville attacks, the death of Heather Heyer, the Unite the Right rally, when, for good reason, I think a lot of us in the United States and beyond were really shaken by what seemed like extremely fringe, radical, anti-democratic, white nationalist political actors suddenly finding themselves not just in the center of the world stage, but also in some ways being apologized for by the U.S. president. We all remember the good people on both sides moment for Trump in his first administration. So I really started the project of writing this book at that time to try to make sense of what to me looked more like an acceleration, if you look at these intellectuals, of the very dynamics of capitalism that argue for, individual competition, intergroup competition, sort of social Darwinist forces being given their full leash and their full sway over politics. I started thinking about that and it all sort of germinated through the Trump one, and then, also it didn't go away during during Biden, and then was able to polish it off just in time for the arrival of the latest, grotesqueries of the present.
We'll come to the sort of the grotesque alliances at the heart of MAGAism later on. The conventional wisdom when people talk about far-right populist movements, or not even necessarily far-right movements on the right, I guess, like Trumpism, Brexit, is that it is a reaction to global capitalism. It's you're railing against globalization, a lack of borders, like mass immigration. Why is that wisdom so conventional? Why is that the sort of the why do you have a sense of why that argument has taken hold at the expense of your very compelling argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some, there's a kernel of truth in the argument that most commonly circulates, and it is best understood if you look at what scholars would call the demand side of these populist movements. So why do voters go to the polls for politicians? What's their motivation? And God knows there's been plenty of reason to be dissatisfied with the economic settlements of the last several decades, whether you're in the UK or the US or elsewhere. There's been wage stagnation, there's been the collapse of all kinds of social security, the rise of precariousness, the regional inequalities that have come through deindustrialization. There's all kinds of reasons to be angry and to want to protest and find someone who you think will express your anger. So in that sense, I think in the first blush of 2016-17, many people focused on that question. What are the voters angry about and why are they voting? Fair enough. The question that was sometimes overshadowed at that moment was, who is it that's offering themselves as the spokespeople for that resentment? And what do they actually have in mind? What do they plan to do? What are their internal intellectual genealogies? And the moment you look there, you find a totally different story. So if you look at the example of Brexit, by now it's quite obvious. But if you look at the people who really organized and led the Brexit movement, I mean, these are, dyed-in-the-wool Thatcherites who believed that the European Union was too socialist and it was strangling British competitiveness. And the UK needed to break out of that straitjacket to be able to go global once again. Hardly a kind of retraction from global competition. Actually, it was an attempt to supercharge and accelerate into global competition. Trump administration was pretty similar. Lots of talk about the grievances of people in the Rust Belt, the American carnage brought about by deindustrialization and competition with China. But once Trump is in office, biggest legislative tax cut of his first administration, the 2017 tax cuts, doesn't really do much at all to reindustrialize the Midwest, does very little to rebuild the social safety net, in fact, goes in the opposite direction. And you could find that pattern playing itself out across many right-wing movements. What I'm trying to show in this book is that this is not a coincidence and it itself has a history. And if you look at the people who were involved in, concocting, devising the programs for, and often governing inside of those parties once they were achieving the status of government, then you find a pretty long, often multi-decade story whereby after the end of the Cold War, many people on the right thought that the socialist communist menace had just transformed into a new shape, and it had gone from being red and communist to green and environmentalist. The affirmative action demands of the civil rights movement, the equal rights demands of the feminist and gay rights movement were all seen as the new enemies. By the 2000s, there was a strong feeling on the right and parts of the neoliberal right, as I described, that those international institutions, whether they're the EU or the World Bank or the WTO, had been somehow hijacked by these new politically correct woke ideologues. And before you know it, you'd have, environmental regulations being rolled out and smothering the spirit of free enterprise. So the moment at which right-wing neoliberals turned against globalization is something that is, initially counterintuitive, but it's something that I think that if we follow the breadcrumb trail of influences, it's pretty easy to understand.
When you talk about that, about the end of the Cold War, it makes me think these people will never be happy or satisfied with any sort of settlement. You think you see the end of the Cold War, famously the end of history.
Yeah,
communism mudded, capitalism wins.
Yep.
But it's just not good enough.
No.
Capitalism winning. It needs to be total, absolute victory, and not just capitalism unfettered from any sort of regulation. Is that just what these people are pursuing?
So I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it that, interestingly, are almost opposite to one another, but both circulated. One argument was on the neoliberal right was we hadn't actually won the Cold War. So the danger of statism, the danger of the Leviathan had survived the death of the Soviet Union. One need look no further than the size of the military-industrial complex. You could point to how much of GDP was still accounted for by state spending. All the entitlement programs that had been built up from the New Deal through the 60s and onward were still there. So you still had Social Security, you still had Medicare, you still had Medicaid. So some people on the right said, we just have a new front of battle now. We need to trim back the hedge of government that has grown out of control. And you can see this, for example, in the Project 2025 attitude of the current Trump administration, right? There's all these parts of the state that to many people seem quite natural and reasonable, Department of Education, Department of Energy, that to them are abominations. Like this is the Leviathan that outlived the Cold War. So that's one angle. We actually lost the Cold War, and we still need to win the big war. That was just a battle and a skirmish and a longer struggle. The second approach is a fear that they were actually not prepared for what might happen if they did win. So this is one of the more, again, counterintuitive, but I find quite compelling angles that some of these intellectuals take, and it's right up front in the introduction of my book. Charles Murray, in particular, says, we've come closer than ever now. We maybe not have won totally, but we're closer than ever. Now we have to contemplate what happens if we do win. What happens if the welfare state and all of the ways it's literally kept alive a lot of the population really does vanish. How will we reconstruct a functioning civil society on the ruins of a group of people that have for generations been able to be dependent on the paternal handouts, as they see it, of the welfare system? So this actually sparks a turn back to the very fundamental questions of human nature, which is really, the core thesis of the book is like, why did neoliberals return to the idea of hardwired human nature and hard understandings of science at this moment of the end of the Cold War? It's partially because they feared that they weren't ready for building up a new order in the ruins of the old that might actually be coming soon. So therefore, you have the debates about very fundamental things. What should money look like? What kind of territories matter? Do populations need to be homogeneous and single race? Do we need traditionalist values of the nuclear family to be able to make sure there's enough, children and offspring to keep these things alive? So that's why this otherwise difficult to explain alliance between libertarians, who are mostly interested in economic freedom, and then conservatives, who are mostly interested in restoring ideas of tradition and morality, they end up working together in the 1990s, because the libertarians are like, oh, dang, we need to build order on something after there's no more state. And the conservatives are like, what kind of economic relations will govern the future? And so they say, well, we both have one enemy. It's the Leviathan. Let's get rid of that, and we can start small again and rebuild, micropolities upward and upward until we have, reestablished something like defensible order, in the course of which it's taken for granted that a lot of people won't make it. That in a kind of social Darwinist purge, as Herbert Spencer said himself in a passage quoted by Charles Murray, when the patient goes off the opium, they can survive, but they don't always survive. So that's the deeper kind of more foundational question that they're confronting in the 90s and 2000s is, what version of human nature is at the core part of a version of social order that might outlast not just the Cold War, but the state itself.
A lot of people, not our audience, because they're the best read audience in the world,
Sure,
might not be across these ideas. I might consider these thinkers to be fringe thinkers if they haven't heard of them. How impactful could their ideas possibly be?
Yeah.
How do we see, or where in contemporary politics are there ideas or people downstream of these ideas?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I couldn't have imagined when this book came out that there would be people as close to power as there are now who share ideas this radical. So I think, as you said, the book was written before the election. I don't think I had I think I still thought it was a coin toss between Trump and Kamala Harris at the time the book was completed. But when this Project 2025 document was released by the Heritage Foundation, it was a really interesting moment. Why? Well, what's the Heritage Foundation first? Again, no, not to impugn the deep knowledge of your listeners and viewers, but the Heritage Foundation maybe is better known to Americans, which it was the first of the right-wing free market think tanks. So the first meaningful one. Not to impugn the Institute for Economic Affairs of London, which will always wear that crown.
They didn't particularly care for your book. I read the review. They were not complimentary.
One of them asked for a free review copy. I was like, bro, let's just go to the market for that one. But the Heritage Foundation started by a guy named Ed Follner in the late 1970s in DC. And his idea is that we need to wage the war of ideas, and we need to do it as close to power as possible. So he talks about using a Leninist strategy. We need to have a vanguard. We are not speaking on behalf of the entire class of the capitalists. We're speaking for them. We can't, consult them all the time. So we need to just be on the spot, making what we think are the best decisions for whatever piece of legislation is coming through the pipeline in DC at any given time. So they set up a really effective ground game where basically when new laws or bills are being passed through the House and the Senate, they just deliver like a one-page, two-side backgrounder to Republican politicians that says basically this is the way you should vote on this issue, because most politicians are not able to stay on top of everything, even with staff. And this was a very quick and easy way to effectively like outsource the act of politics to this policy shop that the Heritage Foundation became. And so they're doing these day-to-day quick backgrounders, but then also when a new Republican president comes into power, they would write up these 1,000-page, what were usually called mandates for leadership, that just gave spec policy ideas to every branch of the government. Handed their first one to Reagan in 1980, and Project 2025 was the one that they handed to Trump in 2024. What that says changes from decade to decade because the most important issues change. But this one was especially stark in its, I would say, like its apocalyptic language about what the government had become. The person who is now the head of the Office of the Management of the Budget, a guy named Russ Vought, pulls no punches. I mean, according to him, most of the government has been taken over by what he would call leftist Marxists, activists. Therefore, because they had totally captured the government, they needed to be totally purged from the government. So the last 3 months that we've been watching in Washington can look to some people like just, ungoverned chaos or undisciplined chaos. But actually, this was the point, was there were certain parts of the government, especially things like USAID, Department of Education, that needed to be done away with altogether. And what that would do to outcomes in education, levels of inequality in the country, let alone, deaths overseas for people who become dependent on aid from the U.S. foreign aid establishment, were all casualties of war, so to speak. Those were all things that would have to be accepted along the way. So that paleoconservative, as distinguished from neoconservatives, neoconservatives being the more familiar ones, the, George W. Bush era, let's use the American state as a way to globalize democracy. The paleoconservatives are defined against that. They're like, no. We roll it all back to the shores of the United States. And then even inside the United States, we trim way back what we expect from the government. So that model, I think, is underway right now, and perhaps even in even more radical ways than certainly I would have expected, or that I describe in my book, in the sense that the very basis for American competitiveness globally in fields of biotech, pharmaceuticals, name the corner of research, nuclear, information communications technologies, which is really dependent on a stream of federal funding, is just being choked off right now at the source. So that dismantleism, that anti-statism, which Murray said, maybe the victory that we're very close to achieving is the one that is underway now. And even, I've mentioned him a few times, but it's worth noting that Charles Murray is like a never Trumper, right? He's not actually on board with this, partially because reading him, he's aware of the hazards and dangers that go into taking apart a society before it's actually, in their minds, healthy enough to take care of itself.
One of the themes of your work is the custodians of capital and economic freedom are only interested in that freedom. They're not interested in more personal freedoms. They're not interested in liberal. They're interested in the liberty of capital, but not the liberty of everyone else. How do we see that within Hayek's Bastards, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the quick and easy ways to define what makes a neoliberal rather than a liberal is that they prioritize economic freedom above all other freedoms. And they have positioned themselves that way through the post-war decades, often because they thought that that was the kind of freedom that was being underemphasized. So in my last book, In Crack Up Capitalism, I talk about the creation of these indices of economic freedom, because people like Milton Friedman and others thought that Democracy House and these other Cold War outlets were too focused on elections, too focused on civil freedoms. They needed to stand up for economic freedoms as such. And the question of whose freedoms those are, the freedoms of the big capitalist, the freedom of the banker, the freedom of the small consumer, the small producer, it shifts around, but it is that is the central idea, that this needs to happen in the world of the economy and free monetized exchange. Where I think things have changed and where I think the Hayek's bastards are different than the Hayeks, as it were, is the Hayeks would speak in a language of neutrality and objectivity. So the idea always was that they weren't acting as just the handmaids of capital. They were creating rules of the game that would be policed neutrally to allow for free entry and free exit by competitors. So you can think of them kind of clad in the robes of judges, even like the European Court of Justice, enforcing free competition, bans on state aid across the European common market. That's, I think, not a bad way to imagine how the Hayekian generations of neoliberals saw themselves, especially the Germanic ones. What's interesting about the later ones, especially thinking here of Murray Rothbard, who is the father of a particularly extreme form of libertarianism called anarcho-capitalism. Not a small state, not a re-engineered state, as the neoliberals usually want, but zero state. Once you get to that point, the guise of neutrality isn't there anymore. And I've been thinking of it as a kind of vulgar neoliberalism or like a mask-off neoliberalism, where you don't have to pretend anymore that this is, or you don't even believe anymore that there is a neutral arbiter or umpire of the rules of the game. Instead, it's really about, raw accumulation and then destruction of your enemies and destruction of the competition. This, I think, comes out in the vibes of the recent months with someone like Peter Thiel, who we know thinks that competition is for losers. And the goal of tech founders is always, grab the whole market, grab the whole sector. You don't allow for or tolerate the idea of competitors. In fact, that's why you burn so much money in your early years, because you're just trying to get to scale to be able to keep everyone out. So that's a kind of vulgar neoliberalism on its own. And then, of course, the theatrics and semiotics of the new Trump administration lend themselves to that too. If you think about the way that the Trump meme coin dropped on inauguration, or even the kind of images that the White House routinely posts of him, with bared muscles and like glistening flesh, it's an extraordinary, not just mask off, but it's like creating this like personalized immediacy around who the source of value and power is. That's like the opposite of the detached arm's length umpire of the rules of the game that someone like Hayek would have promoted. So that vulgarization of the drive to accumulate and the willingness to destroy competitors and enemies really does feel symptomatic of some corrosion of even the dignity that the original generation of Hayekians at least purported to hold up.
There's also a theme of the Hayek's bastards, or the later generations of Hayekians, lean into sort of evolutionary biology, skull measuring to a certain degree. How did we end up there, do you think?
So this is really interesting, especially I think for people who might have heard the name Hayek, and maybe read them, in undergrad for a class that perhaps just parts of Roads to Serfdom, and know him as, all right, isn't he the guy who argued with Keynes? Wasn't it like he the guy who Thatcher liked? Assuming that he was just like a free market economist who thought that the price system was always right and the state was bad at planning things. That would be correct. But there was actually a whole other side to him as well. And that side of him was fascinated in two things. One was law, as I just implied, but the other was the themes from natural sciences and social sciences. So by the 1960s, he started talking a lot about what he called cultural evolution. The idea being that we as a species, humans, were hardwired with experiences that we'd had out on the savannah in prehistoric times, where we lived in small groups and exchanged things in a decommodified way, shared them, looked out for our own, and basically didn't progress. We just kind of bopped along there for like tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of years. Progress kicks in when we start to trade with strangers and we expand out the field of what would become markets. And by the time you get to the, era of the merchant empires in the 1600s, 1700s, you have a global market where people are all exchanging with each other without even ever seeing each other, expanding the international division of labor. And to him, this moment of anonymized global exchange was wonderful and was the point of human development. This all, as he sees it, starts to break down in different ways in the 20th century, cracks up after the First World War, and then in the process of decolonization, you get people asking for different things. There's just like warring factions of the global economy, mostly identifying as socialists. And so part of what he's working through in the 60s and 70s and 80s is like what happened to the spirit of unity as he understood it. And he starts to retroactively reconstruct a news story about humanity, which is that it wasn't just humans as such, which went from the savannah to the globe, but there were populations within humanity that developed more adaptive traits that were better for what we would call like capitalist virtues. So, frugality, ability to think in longer time perspectives, entrepreneurialness, inventiveness, willingness to take on risks. And he saw these things as emerging in some populations and being absent in others. And the groups who developed those things ended up conquering, defeating, outnumbering, depopulating the ones who didn't. So in a way, it was just a really pretty standard retelling of like the idea of the rise of the West. But he told it through a language of cultural evolution, which made it seem different, made it seem new. And some of his followers or associates by the 1990s picked up on that, but then hardened it and made it, rather than just cultural evolution, sort of mimesis and emulation, it became like genetic transmission. Some populations have it, others don't. You're never going to teach them, so why bother? So things like foreign aid, waste of money. Things like the United Nations, waste of time. Some people are at a fundamentally different level of civilization, and they'll never be good capitalists, no matter what you try to do. In the 1990s, this gets, you mentioned skull measuring, but it's really about IQ measuring, right? So, which in the honorable field of psychology anyway, like craniometry, and straight up, what's it called again? You measure the bumps in people's heads. Phrenology, craniometry, phrenology was displaced by craniometry, was eventually displaced by intelligence research by the early 20th century. And it just boomed back in the 1990s as a way to ordinarily rank the world's races, because we were in this rush of interest in the information economy, the knowledge economy. And so this became now part of the way to explain two things. Why is, Japan and China and Singapore and Korea doing so well relative to the United States? And you could scratch China off that in the 90s, but really Japan and Taiwan. Some people said it's because they're high IQ, it's hardwired. Then the second question is, why are our social reform projects from the 60s onwards not working? It's because African Americans have lower IQ. It's hardwired. So they explain things. So that it was a real sort of bastardization of influence within the neoliberal world, but it did come out with a kind of economized version of racism, which I think is very important to highlight, because often in the post-2016 moment, when we talk about the right or the far right, it's understood as an irrational, emotional, outburst expression. So it's because of hate, it's because of resentment, it's a lack of understanding, perhaps even an ignorance. But what I show is that actually there are self-contained, coherent on their own terms arguments for racism inside the far-right world in ways that heavily overlap with the neoliberal thought community, which come to conclusions about racial inferiority and superiority through economic reasoning, which is not, I think, something that's totally part of the conversation, but it helps to understand how arguments about the inferiority of certain immigrant populations can be kind of laundered and mainstreamed and made more palatable to your average, even university educated right-wing voter.
What was interesting on reading your book is seeing how the racial language or the racial stuff was forgiven almost by people in the community. If you take Peter Brimlow, for example,
Yeah.
he was writing screeds of racist crap
Yeah.
alongside his financial self-help books
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
in the 80s. And there's a bit where I think it's his editor, the newspaper that he works for, just writes, "This is obviously brilliant satire."
Yeah.
And if he was a communist writing this, or like someone on a heterodox economic thinker on the left, he just probably wouldn't be forgiven
Yeah.
for that stuff, would he?
Yeah. It's really hard to try to get into the mind of just the base level stupidity of that editor.
That's what
I mean,
thought as
it
well.
was one of those moments you're reading through and you just shake your head. You're like, oh man, how do you not realize you're being played? But it brings us up to the present because there are provocateurs like that have, a certain kind of basic wit and intellect to them, as Brimlow obviously did. I'm thinking here of someone like Curtis Yarvin, who similarly will say outrageous things. There should be an IQ bar for citizenship for the franchise in post-apartheid South Africa. Useless workers should be sealed inside of, honeycomb-like cells and given video games to entertain them. Perhaps they could be pulped into biodiesel for San Francisco's buses. He'll say these things that one, I suppose, shouldn't really take seriously. They're just excessive satirical, flights of fancy. But then they get mainstream and normalized, and people like that draw closer and closer to positions of power. And now, as just happened this week, Curtis Yarvin was, given the stage at Harvard and, engaged into a conversation and a respectable debate with one of the most well-respected intellectuals and political theorists at the university. So I think it's really a instructive lesson in how cautious we should be, I think, about accepting the supposed satire that people are proposing, when indeed, as you say, it only seems to work in one direction. Certain kinds of exaggeration and sharpening are permissible, but other kinds would, of course, land you in hot water.
If at your home university, Boston University, you've been invited to engage in a debate with Yarvin, would you have done it?
No, because I think that he is a person who is basically a snob, and he longs for elite approval. And I don't really see why we should give it to him. I think there's a real tension, and there always has been on the far right, between elitism and populism. The tradition of the far right, connected to someone like Julius Evola, the Italian fascist that Yarvin actually likes to quote, is one that believes that there is an aristocracy of the soul. So not all people are able to divine, the true nature of things. And the calling of the far right was actually to those people who had that esoteric wisdom and that insight. And then Evola's call was for them to ride the tiger. So just let this whole thing collapse, and at the very end, you'll be able to be still standing and start to begin the reconstruction of the ruins. So there's obviously a contradiction between that and an idea of building a mass movement, let alone a mass political party. Because if you have a basic low opinion of the capacity for insight of average people, and if you don't believe in economic determinism, or an idea that people's political sensibilities are partially determined by where they find themselves in the wage relation and the socioeconomic ladder, then it is all kind of a game. And it's fun, actually, to watch it burn. And, Kali Yuga, or the dark period that humanity is entering, has been determined in advance anyway by the cycles of history. So why not just take a slightly detached and bemused attitude to it and, throw bombs in when you see fit? And that's, I would say, the attitude of someone like him. And there are other far-right intellectuals who are not unintelligent people who are playing that basically destructive role. And we're in a moment where, the time is ripe for that. I think there's all kinds of conditions that lend themselves to acceleration of destruction. And I see my role as acting in opposition to that, not, helping to accelerate it.
I'm interested where we see Trump and the MAGA movement in the context of this, because the assessment of the MAGA coalition is, on the one hand, you've got libertarian figures like Peter Thiel and Musk. On the other,
Yeah.
you've got nativists like Steve Bannon.
hmm
Why have those people decided to put their differences aside?
hmm
And also, I suppose with Trump as well, he's anti-immigration, but also anti-free trade to the extent where he's going to put
hmm
tariffs on films,
Yeah.
which suggests he's not necessarily one of Hayek's bastards, or is he a
Yeah.
bastard of the bastard of the bastard of the bastard?
Yeah.
How much does Donald Trump fit into this analysis? And do you think that this coalition will break down at some point? If will the
Mhm.
differences become irreconcilable?
Yeah. So I think that it's always good to take apart, the president himself from his coterie of cabinet and and the larger sort of penumbra of funders and advisors. I think that discerning the economic rationality of the president himself is difficult and does seem to lend itself best to the kind of dynastic prestige, uh, high margin, high profit enterprises that one sees in places like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. So I think it's not for nothing that his son was at a launch of a new Trump Tower Jeddah and said that no other country in the world has been kinder to us than Saudi Arabia. And then he said he thinks it is a tale of two families. So I think there's a lot there in terms of building um, a kind of order in which gains are wildly disproportionately focused on a small percentage of the residents of a population and focused on non-renewable resources like oil, and then funneled into specifically high-end architecture and high prestige sporting and entertainment events. So I think that's his mentality. And I think one thing that's also specific about him, and I'll get to Musk in a sec, I think there's some similarities, is that Trump has always acted with a safety net, and the safety net was the United States state and the government. So what would have been catastrophic failures in the 1980s and 90s were prevented from being so by the existence of a very, very generous corporate bankruptcy law in the United States and a very generous tax law for writing off the kind of large losses that he suffered. So I think there's a kind of gravitylessness that he has learned to take for granted, that once you are the state and you are the government, you're really playing with fire if you are going to risk the credibility of the United States dollar and the government as such. And that's, I think, what we're seeing now is how much is he actually shredding his own net, his own safety net. As far as the larger question, which gets raised a lot, like why are tech libertarians lining up with economic nationalists? First of all, I would question the libertarian part of it. My last book, Crack Up Capitalism, begins with Peter Thiel in 2009 saying, I no longer think freedom and democracy are compatible. And what we need to do is exit politics in all its forms and create as many possible new countries and polities as possible, right? This is why he funds the Seasteading Institute and gets excited about these offshore enclaves and zones. But the book ends in 2016 with Thiel speaking at the Republican National Convention. So he seems to have gotten over his aversion to existing states and come to the conclusion, as I suggest, that it might be easier to take over an existing state than to start a new one. And I would say that set the trajectory for the rest of the tech class, which has now actually progressively abandoned its allergy to statism, as long as they are the ones providing the services, software, direction of travel for that state. I think a much better capsule summary of the tech mindset now is the one put forth by Thiel's collaborator and co-founder Alexander Karp in his best-selling book, The Technological Republic. So the idea of that book is the same as what Mark Andreessen has been pushing through his American Dynamism initiative, which is like we actually need to get rid of our sheepishness about working with the government. The government is not only our best contract, but it is necessary to create the conditions for the rest of the business environment in which we operate. So that fusion of private and public power that we see now has little to do with libertarianism, I would say. It has a lot to do with the centrality of tech in the US economy over the last 25 years, the leverage that they've secured over that time period, and now what they feel like is the need for a strong hand on the tiller of policy to make sure the kind of inputs that they need for their, especially super energy hungry AI initiatives are, kept flowing directly into the data centers. So that angle of needing power, being fine with working with the state, is, of course, tempered by concern about what the economic nationalists are all about, which is, by their own language, they're about America for the Americans, keeping out new immigrants, deporting many current residents, and theoretically bringing back some level of economic balance to the U.S. economy by bringing back certain forms of manufacturing, industrializing, repatriating supply chains, and so on. And that is, I think, a volatile space for the tech economic nationalist coalition. I think there's some gains for the tech people. Someone like Musk is actually pretty well placed, considering how much of SpaceX is made in-house, how much they've been working for the last decade anyway to source things for batteries domestically, to make synthetic graphite instead of mining natural graphite, getting it from China. So I think that it's a dangerous play for them. Can they still succeed even with a hardcore economic nationalist policy? It means losing overseas markets, but there's a lot to be gained too. So they're going to roll out huge new defense budget. They're going to use tariff policy not to decouple from the global economy, but to compel foreign markets to open up for U.S. tech products. So the latest is that there is negotiation that certain tariff rates can be dropped if countries will allow Starlink in as a service provider. And we'll see many more of those quid pro quos, which I think show how an aggressive trade policy and a even still globalizing economy can actually work in complementary ways sometimes. I think that's their hope. They don't want it really all to withdraw back to autarky. That's scary, I think, for everybody, every capitalist, I should say. But I think they have good reason to think they'd be able to persuade Trump out of that hard position.
Quinn Slobodian, thank you so much for coming in.
It was my pleasure.